Hello everyone, and welcome to our lecture series for Chapter 25 in your textbook, Give Me Liberty by Dr. Eric Foner. This chapter is entitled The Sixties, 1960 to 1968. The first section of this lecture is the Civil Rights Revolution. The focus question for this first section is, what were the major events in the civil rights movement in the early 1960s? As the 1950s rolled into the 1960s, a new wave of protests emerged against segregation, particularly in the South, where segregation was most deeply embedded. The first and most notable of these that really galvanized these protest movements in general were the Greensboro sit-ins in Greensboro, North Carolina, from February to July of 1960. In this event, African-American students in Greensboro, North Carolina, protested segregation by sitting at a segregated Woolworth store lunch counter and refusing to move. It started out with just 4 students, the infamous Greensboro 4, these gentlemen that you see right here. But as the days progressed, more and more activists joined these 4 students to sit stoically at this lunch counter, despite being constantly insulted verbally, attacked physically, had food thrown at them, water poured on their heads, and the fact that they would sit there stoically just taking this sort of abuse was one of the key elements to the success of this movement, as these events were televised and broadcast across the country. The Greensboro sit-in inspired similar events across the South and worked very much to help to desegregate these sorts of lunch counters and other restaurant-type establishments in the South. Also in 1960, and also in North Carolina, African-American students formed the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, the SNCC, also known as SNCC, which was formed in Raleigh in 1960. And this group sponsored all sorts of anti-segregation protest measures, including, most famously, the Freedom Rides. And this was an event where integrated groups of protesters traveled on buses into the Deep South to force compliance with court-ordered desegregation on interstate transportation. Much like the situation in Greensboro at the sit-ins, these Freedom Riders were often attacked by violent mobs, both verbally and physically, and faced arrest for their actions in these Freedom Rides. But the publicity that emerged from these events, similar to the situation in Greensboro, helped to galvanize the sympathy for this movement and did help to end segregation on interstate transportation. The rising wave of protests in the early 1960s crested in 1963 with actions in Birmingham, Alabama, one of the most segregated cities in all of the entire South. Martin Luther King Jr. became involved in these activities and actually was arrested for violating a ban on protests in the city. While incarcerated in Birmingham, he wrote his famous Letter from a Birmingham Jail, which is probably one of his most famous written works and served as a manifesto, if you will, for his non-violent approach to the civil rights movement. And this document really thrust MLK front and center in the larger civil rights movement nationally. Even though MLK was incarcerated for violating the ban on protests in Birmingham, the protests did continue. And televised coverage of these protests saw African-American men, women, and children being attacked by police dogs, nightsticks, and fire hoses. This outraged the country and the world and shifted public opinion in sympathy with protesters and racial justice. The success emphasized the significance of MLK's nonviolent approach and the medium of television in communicating the dichotomy between the violence of the authorities on one hand and the stoic nonviolence of the protesters on the others. When protesters refused to answer violence with violence, they gained the moral high ground. The high point of the nonviolent civil rights movement came on August 28, 1963, with the famous March on Washington. 250,000 black and white protesters participated in this march, where they called for jobs and freedom. They desired and were advocating for a new civil rights bill, new public works programs, an increase in the minimum wage, and a ban on workplace discrimination. The most famous episode of this march, of course, was Martin Luther King Jr.'s famous "I Have a Dream" speech, where he laid out a colorblind ideology and approach to civil rights, which really served as the basis for racial justice and race relations in the United States up until very, very recently in American history. That concludes part 1 of our Chapter 25 lecture series for your textbook, Gimme Liberty by Dr. Eric Foner. As always, study hard, and I'll see you soon.